Thank you so much, Dr. Gonzales. Thank you to everyone who's here today. I wanted to thank the Health Sciences Center Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for inviting me to participate today. And because I rarely have an audience of healthcare workers, I also wanted to thank everyone at the HSC for keeping us all healthy and well during this pandemic and always. So I'm delighted to be here. And yes, as Dr. Gonzales mentioned, I am here to talk about Nina Otero-Warren, and I wanted to share a quick picture with you of, I guess we'll see my desktop, of the new quarter with Nina Otero-Warren. So this is the quarter that will be issued later on this year. And she'll be included among notable American women such as Maya Angelou. I think Sally Ride is one of the women who will be featured. And this is a really exciting moment. As you can see, the element they've chosen to focus on for the quarter is her advocacy of women's suffrage. One of the things that she was really celebrated in 2020, the year that the centenary of women's right to vote got the short shrift thanks to the pandemic. A notable figure, and we'll be talking about that aspect of her life, but she's a fascinating figure who is an interesting historical subject and historical actor for many, many reasons. So let's see, not sure what exactly I've told this to focus on. Let's see, come over here. Okay, so Adelina Nina Otero-Warren was born into near her family's home in La Constancia, which is near Belen, in 1881. Otero-Warren is our subject today in part because of the suffrage centenary and the releasing of her quarter, but also because she has done so many fascinating and remarkable things during her life. In addition to advocating for suffrage in New Mexico, which meant really convincing politicians in New Mexico to vote to ratify the 19th Amendment as it was made to the U.S. Constitution. She also was the first Hispana in the U.S. to run for national office when she ran for the House. Oh my gosh, when she ran for a House seat shortly after women gained the right to run for public office here in New Mexico. And her cousin Soledad Chavez Chacón was the first female Secretary of State in the country. So Soledad Chacón, also another advocate for suffrage, as was Otero-Warren's other cousin, Aurora Lucero Whiteley, a folklorist, right, who we're just now starting to find out more about. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about her suffrage work, her candidacy for Congress, and a little bit about her book, Old Spain in Our Southwest, which she published in 1936. So here's a great picture of her from the Palace of the Governor's photo archives later in life after she had run for Congress. Usually narratives about Otero-Warren focus on her family's long and eminent political history in New Mexico. Her, I think uncle, Miguel Otero, was the territorial governor for a period of time. And her family had both sides of her family, the Luna side of her family and the Otero side of her family had been very active in politics in New Mexico in the 19th century and start of the 20th century. So when New Mexico was a territory starting in 1848 until it gained statehood in 1912. Let's see. Eloisa Luna, who is Nina Otero-Warren's mother, and Manuel B. Otero had 3 children, Eduardo, Nina, and Manuel. However, Manuel was born a month after his father's death at the hands of an American land grant squatter and millionaire, James Whitney, who shot Manuel B. Otero in the neck as he asked Whitney to leave lands that were Otero's by use and which were under legal dispute. So this is has to do with a land grant claim or squatter's rights on a land grant. While a wounded Whitney was spirited away by his family members and then was redirected to trial in Valencia County, he was let out on bail by a judge who let Whitney leave for California. Eloisa, who was 19 years old and pregnant, welcomed her husband's body as Whitney left the state. Although certainly the topic of its own presentation, there are several folk songs treating the events leading up to Manuel B. Otero's death, including an Indita detailing the events of the confrontation, which is documented by Donald Chavez and Chavez y Gilbert and Enrique Lamadrid, as well as songs by Casimiro Luján of Torreón and another by Plácido Romero of Peralta, which was documented by Otero-Warren's good friend, Erna Ferguson. These tell the tragic and unjust events of Otero-Warren's childhood, and I think one of the things that's very interesting about Otero-Warren is when her success in political arenas is discussed, it's often sort of attributed to her family connections or something like that, but a lot of it has to do with how she was understood as a historical figure in her time, and part of that was understanding her family as a land-grant family whose lands had been sort of attempted to be possessed, right? And whose family had experienced tragedies that other families in New Mexico had also experienced. So this is one of the ways in which she's known. And much of her political efficacy has to do with her own ability to speak two languages, to speak between cultures, and her own charisma, which we'll see in just a second. Her mother, Eloisa Luna, gave birth to Manuel a month after his father's death and later remarried, having 9 children with her husband, Alfred Berger. One of Otero-Warren's half-sisters, Estela Berger, married the conservationist Aldo Leopold, the author of the Sand County Almanac. And the trail that bears his name is right nearby here on the Bosque, right? You can go do the Aldo Leopold Trail if you're going to go for a spin, little walk on the Bosque. So it's nice to see that historical connection. Otero-Warren referred to Aldo Leopold as her favorite brother-in-law of the many she had to choose from. Otero-Warren's family moved from Los Lunas to Santa Fe, and Otero-Warren, who had long been supported by the family's nanny, attended school first at St. Vincent's Academy in Albuquerque and then at Maryville College in St. Louis, returning home in her teenage years, moving east to attend Catholic college as many children of families of means did in New Mexico at that time. Her cousin Miguel B. Otero, who served as territorial governor. Nina Otero met U.S. Cavalry Officer Rawson D. Warren at a party in Albuquerque in 1907. And in 1908, they were married in Santa Fe, soon moving to Fort Wingate. Otero-Warren soon discovered that her husband had a partner and 2 children living in the Philippines, and this, combined with her general dissatisfaction with Army wife life, ended her marriage. She returned to her family in Santa Fe and was generally referred to as the widow Nina Otero-Warren. She began to engage in civic and political activities in Santa Fe, including suffrage organizations, which included chairing the Child Welfare Department in Santa Fe. And when in 1907 property rights were seized from women in New Mexico by new American laws imposed on the territory, Nina ensured that she and her sisters were financially taken care of by trusts established from her mother's Eloisa's estate. By the time Otero-Warren was in her mid-30s, she had become a significant figure in a variety of public offices in New Mexico and had taken on leadership roles, including superintendent of public schools of Santa Fe County. She was therefore targeted by national organizations, including the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the Congressional Union, to organize and advocate for women's right to vote. Many other states had, by 1915, granted women state-level rights to vote, but New Mexico had not done so, and movement nationally to amend the Constitution guaranteeing women the federal right to vote was in full swing. Otero-Warren was already involved with the National Association of Women's Clubs, which had also lobbied, unsuccessfully, for women's right to vote using less overtly political approaches. Otero-Warren soon became a primary point of articulation between national suffrage organizations, in particular the Congressional Union, and the ground game in New Mexico for organizing and lobbying elected officials to weigh in positively on women's right to vote. Otero-Warren's efforts in this regard are a field of ongoing study. Present-day literary critics and historians are re-examining the conversation about the suffrage movement across the U.S. in light of its centenary, and Otero-Warren's name, of course, emerges as a vital voice in the movement. And so one text to consider taking a look at is by former UNM faculty member Kathleen Cahill, whose book Recasting the Vote examines how women of color transformed the suffrage movement. And one of the cases that she studies is, of course, that of Nina Otero-Warren. So this is hot off the press, just in time for celebration of women's suffrage. Okay. In New Mexico, Otero-Warren was very successful in parlaying her own political experiences and leveraging her knowledge and connections to effect change. As her biographer, Charlotte Whaley, puts it, that considerable arm twisting on the part of Nina and others was having a positive effect on the New Mexico legislators in Washington was evident. She had brought to the battle her knowledge of the bureaucracy learned at an early age. Otero-Warren's ground game was superb, though she was fighting against some very politically dug-in opponents, including Thomas B. Catron, the one-term New Mexico senator who rebuffed all discussion of suffrage. She did earned the support of Governor Octaviano Larrasoldo. The work of Otero-Warren and her suffrage colleagues to see the state pass its own suffrage legislation was not successful, as in 1917, the state legislature voted down suffrage on a state level again, this time by a very narrow margin of 4 votes. Undeterred, Otero-Warren continued to lobby state legislators and congressmen, becoming more confident and effective. Again, Charlotte Whaley. Nina had discovered the joy and drama of revolutionary politics and of breaking down stereotypes, and in the process, she had learned to trust her own strength and judgment. End quote. With the advent of World War I, suffrage voices nationwide took on a different timbre, as many activists, including Otero-Warren, took on multiple civic roles in addition to their advocacy of suffrage. With Erna Ferguson and Alice Corbin Henderson in Albuquerque, Otero-Warren collaborated in war efforts, involving herself with the Red Cross in Santa Fe, war bonds, and other causes. Whaley notes that in 1918, state and federal legislators, perhaps in an attempt to sidestep, ignore, or quell suffrage voices, decided to focus on prohibition legislation instead, which of course would take effect nationally in 1920 and be repealed 15 years later. Nevertheless, Nina Otero-Warren and others persisted. Eventually, in June 1919, the Congress of the United States of America passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, awarding women the right to vote. This amendment required 36 states to ratify it for it to be enacted as law, and Otero-Warren put shoulder to the wheel in New Mexico to see it happen. Although approval of the constitutional amendment passed the New Mexico House, it failed in the Senate, where a substitute referendum for suffrage was proposed. Back to lobbying efforts and fearful that similar efforts would be successful in other states, Otero-Warren and her colleagues redoubled their efforts, and in February 1920, both houses of the New Mexico State Legislature voted to ratify the 19th Amendment. New Mexico was the 32nd state to vote in favor of amending the Constitution to guarantee women the right to vote, and in 1920, it became so for women throughout the United States. After taking a moment to catch her breath and awaiting the amendment of the New Mexico State Constitution in 1921, permitting women to hold public office, Otero-Warren put both new legal abilities to work as they were intended and tested out her own considerable political pull and acumen. She ran for a congressional seat. Aside from solidifying support from friends and colleagues she had worked with in promotion of suffrage, her first challenge lay within the Republican Party, which is the party in which she ran at the time. Otero-Warren stumped from county to county, traveling by automobile and promoting her political goals and candidacy. She announced her candidacy in various newspapers, including in La Revista de Taos, as we can see here, where she expresses her goals in excellent Spanish. Otero-Warren writes in extremely articulate Spanish, "Si soy electa, me esmeraré en el representar conscientemente los intereses del pueblo de Nuevo México, con especial atención al proyecto de reclamaciones, las cédulas de tarifa, la extensión de necesarios créditos a rancheros y creadores de ganado, la justa liquidación de la deuda que las naciones les deben a aquellos que las defendieron durante la última guerra." This candidacy statement goes on to describe other aspects of her platform, specifically those promoting the education and well-being of children and families, issues dear to her heart and which she would continue to advocate for the rest of her life. Among these are appealing to the federal government for support for the state in progresar en materias de educación y en materias de salud y en el bienestar de la niñez. So advancing educational ends, health ends, and child well-being, and advancing child labor laws para hacer efectiva la legislación de la labor de los niños. She closes by acknowledging with graciousness the honor that her nomination and election would bring, and her full intention to do well by the people of New Mexico as an elected official of the state. She says, "Si soy la escogida de la Convención Republicana para esta oficina, consideraré aquello un alto honor y una oportunidad para el servicio." Of note is that Otero-Warren's Spanish, there is no indication given that the statement was translated for her, and she did publish other letters and statements in Spanish in the newspapers, is excellent, despite the lack of opportunities for education in Spanish in New Mexican schools during her childhood. Although Otero-Warren's biographer Whaley implies several times that her family and Nuevo Mexicano background carried the day in terms of her ability to appeal to Nuevo Mexicano residents of the state, I would argue that without the ability to speak and otherwise communicate proficiently in Spanish, these qualities would otherwise not have been sufficient for her to be as effective as she was. Her language abilities, as well as the cultural knowledge that accompanied them, were fundamental to her success as a civil servant, lobbyist, and candidate. Otero-Warren handily won the Republican primary against incumbent Congressman Nestor Montoya and began her campaign against John Marrow, the Democratic candidate for the congressional seat. Otero-Warren's candidacy and advocacy was unfolding in a political environment that had been in a push-pull since New Mexico became a territory in 1846-48 and became beyond when it was finally granted statehood in 1912. It was meshed in what was a very tense social and political milieu. So here, I'm not going to read the entire poem, but there is a poem that was published in 1922 in support of Adelina Nina Otero-Warren's candidacy for the congressional seat by Felipe M. Chacón, Felipe Maximiliano Chacón, one of the members of the Chacón family that included Rafael Chacón and the writer and lawyer Eusebio Chacón from Trinidad, Colorado. This is the title of the poem, and here we have two examples of the poem. This is the original, and we won't go too deep into this poem. And here's the translation. We can sort of see the nature of this type of writing, which is, of course, very typical in style of writing that we see in the early 20th century in Mexico. That stylistic carryover into New Mexico is to be expected given the amount of exchange that was occurring in the newspapers and in other means of Spanish language communication that readily crossed the borders and was advocated for. So here we see your brow is encircled by laurel and your name radiates honor. Your star rises today over the threshold of a new day's triumphant dawn. The world advances and so too human thought, and new things into this life are born. Today reflects the morning light of a new dawn into which women are born. Born into suffrage as man's equal, but a more spiritually elevated soul, her name tills in moral purity, and the earth profits through her laser. This meritorious evolution, marking the elevated path of progress, will cover New Mexico in glory by sending a woman to Congress. And then the poem concludes with, "Hear, hear, a toast, a pledge of joy, and of gratitude from a progressive citizen who sends you in this humble verse, the salute of a sovereign people." So this is the translation that Gabriel Melendez and I completed of the original poem. For more of Felipe M. Chacón's work, including both of these poems in Spanish and English and the other works, you can check out this book that we just published in November 2021, El Feliz, Ingenio, Neomexicano, which is the transcription, translation, introduction, and notes to Felipe Chacón's Poesía y Prosa, which is the first work of Mexican-American poetry published, complete book of Mexican-American poetry published here in New Mexico in 1924. So if you're interested, this is where you can find more of that particular poem and other works by Felipe M. Chacón. But of course, this one really stood out because of its very clear and emphatic advocacy for Otero-Warren's candidacy as a female, the first Latina to run for national office. Okay, back to PowerPoint. Where are you? Nope, back here. We already took a close look at the poem. Let's skip along to a little bit more information about what she did after when she ran for Congress. So beyond depicting Otero-Warren as a national political figure representative of women's right to vote and hold office, Chacón considers the specific qualities demonstrating her appropriateness for office. Perhaps referencing her previous political and civic work, Chacón praises Otero-Warren's accomplishments. Completed, as he says, en pureza moral y la tierra va bien en su jornada. She is furthermore habilidosa, competente, honrada, de alma gentil, de corazón sincero, all qualities that both incur and reflect what Chacón frames as a divine mandate for her as a political candidate. And yet, as remarkable as her moral and personal character is, Otero-Warren is in these same respects the nuevomexicana every woman, the dama típica, a candidate of her people and also called by them, del pueblo proclamada. Apart from the political and ideological messages about Otero-Warren embedded in the poem, Chacón writes his support in extremely elegant literary verse. And he uses all of his considerable poetic skill to say just the opposite of, to say only positive things about Otero-Warren. Though A la Señora Adelina Otero-Warren is by no means the only example of an artistic text supporting Otero-Warren's candidacy, its frankness is echoed in newspaper editorials and in the support she received from many quarters, sometimes outside of New Mexico. Here in an article in the September 1922 Omaha, Nebraska Bee, an article discusses Otero-Warren's primary victor over Nestor Montoya, naming New Mexico as the latest state to wheel into line with a woman candidate for Congress. This brief news piece praises Otero-Warren for her victory over Montoya, noting that, quote, her compelling victory is notable because of the admitted popularity of the man she defeated. He was elected to Congress 2 years ago by the largest plurality ever given a candidate for the office in New Mexico, and the selection of Mrs. Otero-Warren is therefore the more impressive. The article closes with high hopes for her victory in the congressional election, and it comments explicitly not only on her gender, but also on her Spanish bilingualism, which here is seen for the good, saying, quote, it is not unreasonable to expect that Miss Alice, another candidate, will not be lonesome in the next Congress, for she will have a colleague not only of her sex, but speaking as well the language of the great Southwest, end quote. In Taos, the Republican-oriented Revista de Taos expressed support for Otero-Warren's candidacy as the Republican candidate for Congress. Not only does the newspaper name her many civic and political positions, it comments explicitly on her involvement in the advancement of suffrage in New Mexico as, quote, presidenta de los clubes de Federación de Mujeres del Estado durante la campaña a favor del sufragio de la mujer en Nuevo México, gracias a cuyos esfuerzos se debe el triunfo en el estado de esta medida. So acknowledging her leadership roles and her advancement of voting in favor of the amendment to the Constitution supporting women's right to vote. The article goes on to say how her proven leadership in the past should leave no doubt as to her future abilities in high office, and specifically talks about her as a female congressman as demostraría que la energía, la dignidad, la inteligencia o sabiduría no son solo propias del varón hispano, sino de la mujer, en capitals, de esta raza. El triunfo de la señora Otero-Warren es necesario para el más grande orgullo de Nuevo México y de la raza hispana, especialmente al referirnos al sexo mujeril, que debe ver en el triunfo de Nina Otero-Warren una de sus mayores glorias. So she becomes a sort of representative figure for women running for political office and for women in positions of political power. Clearly, although La Revista de Taos was biased towards Republican candidates, its support of Otero-Warren was also based in gender, and not, as detractors who worked against her suggested by dragging her short-lived marriage into the conversation, a negative characteristic. After a vigorous campaign, however, Otero-Warren lost the election to the Democratic candidate at a time when the two parties were shifting in terms of their racial composition and predominance in New Mexico. As some political historians of New Mexico have noted, the 1922 election, to which Otero-Warren's candidacy pertained, was the beginning of a move of many New Mexicans towards the Democratic Party. In any event, Otero-Warren did not lose by a huge margin, approximately 9%. In particular, as biographer Whaley notes, because she was, quote, the first woman to challenge an all-male political system. And that year, the Democrats elected a governor, James Hinkle, and most of the state officials. Despite the lack of female political role models before Nina's campaign, and with no tradition of participation in structured party politics, Hispanic women had quickly become active voters, and most had voted for her, end quote. Though the loss must have come as a disappointment to Otero-Warren, Whaley further notes of the 1920 amendment securing women's right to vote, and citing cultural critic Vivian Gornick, that, quote, women had been released from a collective lifetime of silence, and, quote, those with brains and visionary ideas were no longer considered eccentric, and many had discovered a sustaining inner clarity and strength, end quote. And this is certainly the case in Otero-Warren, who continues to advocate for various political changes in New Mexico, even as she establishes her own business and writes a book. So we'll get to that in just a moment. Let's see. Nina Otero-Warren did not rest for long, nor did she run again for federal office. She did help her brother Manuel Otero run for governor in 1924, though he lost by less than 200 votes to a Democrat, causing many to suspect ballot box stuffing. In fact, she continued to be who she was in her many different facets, advocating for educational reforms for adults and children in New Mexico, buying a homestead property outside of Santa Fe and operating with her friend Mamie Meters, and continuing to be the heart and legal guardian of her family's home in Santa Fe, where her numerous siblings, their children, and her stepfather moved through. And this is sort of a really interesting, I don't have a slide for this, but this is an area that I've been sort of doing newer research on Nina Otero-Warren. She was obviously involved in the Works Progress Administration, and one of the responsibilities she was charged with was educating monolingual Spanish adults in bilingual education. So the Albuquerque Public Library actually has an archived version of one of the guides that she wrote about language education for adults in New Mexico. So through her association with the WPA, she was involved in educational reforms. She was involved in establishing certain types of educational structures in New Mexico. And it's an area that really deserves a much closer look because she held a number of appointed offices. And through those positions, she was able to exert sort of indirect influence in the way policy was shaped in New Mexico in a manner that was very effective. Let's see. After she established the Las Dos homestead just outside of Santa Fe, Otero-Warren began work in the mid-1930s on the book through which I met her as a literature professor, called Old Spain and Our Southwest, which was published by HBJ, Harcourt Brace Jovanovich in 1936. Otero-Warren, through her social contacts in Santa Fe, had been encouraged by friends in the literary community there and elsewhere to write about her memories of New Mexico daily life and culture from the time of her childhood in Los Lunas and the stories and practices she recalled. Literary scholar Diana Rebolledo grouped Otero-Warren's writing with that of two other nuevomexicana authors of the epic who also sought to write down and preserve their history, stories, and cultural values as they remember them. Cleofas Jaramillo in her various books, especially Sombras del Pasado and Romance of a Little Village Girl, and Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca Gilbert's We Fed Them Cactus. All three women were born in the 19th century, and Cabeza de Vaca Gilbert, the youngest of the three, and you might recognize her cookbook as the one that PNM used to give you when you would open an account with them. It's still the New Mexico cookbook that many, many people use. And they were all involved in what Rebolledo terms the cultural flourishing of the northern New Mexico literary scene. Old Spain and Our Southwest is a fascinating compilation of several different types of information. The first things that she writes about are historical reflections presented through the lens of Spanish colonial history in New Mexico. This is followed by descriptions of day-to-day life in New Mexico, including celebrations such as saints' days and feasts, and certain concepts that have particular value in New Mexico, such as Otero-Warren's description of what water means here. She writes, quote, "Water actually means the livelihood of the people, not only food, the product of gardens and fields, but all that their surplus may be exchanged for. So water is carefully guarded and saved. There's little wonder that the saints are taken into the fields, that they may intercede for the farmer, and that God in his mercy may send rain. Water is sacred indeed," end quote. After exploring some of these fundamental concepts, Otero-Warren focuses on specific historical aspects pertaining to New Mexico, including the explanation of various place names, the patron of the St. Francis Cathedral of Santa Fe, and some background on schooling in New Mexico. And this is a very interesting part of the book. As she worked in education, she was quite aware of what the narratives were outside of the state regarding education in New Mexico, the intervention of public schools in New Mexico. One of the very first things that she does in the chapter on education is assert that Nuevo Mexicanos have always valued education, that they had educational structures in place prior to becoming territories of the United States, and certainly prior to becoming a state. Indeed, she says the first schools in New Mexico were the estufas or kivas of the Pueblo people. So this is, I think that I see in this sort of comment, and indeed in Old Spain and Our Southwest as a book as a whole, responses to views from outside of what New Mexico was at the turn of the 20th century, and her sort of critical and historical response to that, couched or rising from a great deal of political knowledge. And I see that, Melissa, you've popped back on the screen, so I'll wrap this up. Rebolledo said in her just to say a little bit more, the book's final closing recounts songs and stories from New Mexico's past, quotes Chilean Nobel Prize-winning poet Gabriela Mistral, inciting examples from New Mexico's trova, ballads, and verse, as well as folk stories. And also she has a fantastic glossary where she introduces some bilingual concepts. She shows her great understanding of both Spanish and English, of different registers of language, different types of different degrees of formality of expression, and so forth. Let's see. In addition, in the articulation of many women in her book are shown to exert considerable social power and display social cultural tension between Nuevo Mexicanos and Anglos in New Mexico of the time. And we see humor that typified typical Nuevo Mexicano life, as in the conclusion of the story, The Beggar, or of the explanation of the story of the Garrapata Canyon near Taos, where its name comes from. In the glossary, English and Spanish intersect in the expressions she records, such as ay, pope, meaning their puppy. We see regionalisms in her explanation of la gallina de la tierra as the word for turkey, as many New World animals were called de la tierra if there wasn't an equivalent concept in Spain. So gallina de la tierra is, a big chicken from the New World, and also known as guajolote or torque or various other things. Let's see. And she shares offhandedly expressions such as ni con jabón de la Puebla, to say something so dirty that not even soap from a soap-producing town could clean it, or something like tan tonto como un burro. In short, Otero-Warren's literary career, which was not limited to Old Spain and our Southwest, she published shorter pieces, and indeed the area that interests me most is to sort of see some of the internal publications that she created in her leadership roles and through the WPA. Through these, they all shared the same sort of entrepreneurial and far-sighted characteristics that we see in her political work and in her civic work. And I don't know if this is a good time to stop. I have one more picture here. This is a picture of Nina Otero-Warren. She is at a costume party where she's dressed as Doña Tules. And this is an image of her in her later years. It sort of summarizes the long line of strong women, or mujerotas, to which Nina Otero-Warren pertained. Here you can see Otero-Warren in 1949 at a party she hosted at the McGoffin home in Santa Fe, which was soon after demolished to make a parking lot for the La Fonda Hotel. The costume party was themed as a 19th century gambling salon, and Otero-Warren dressed up as María Gertrudis de Barceló, who was better known in her day as La Tules, the controversial proprietor of a well-known 19th century casino and brothel in Santa Fe. La Tules was herself a powerful social and political figure in her day, owning her property and directing her business affairs with aplomb. In invoking La Tules, Otero-Warren reminded Nuevo Mexicanos of their histories and of the mujerotas who had always been in their midst. And so you can see, again, she's in this sort of the social context where she uses the opportunity to teach something about Nuevo Mexicano history and culture in these sorts of spaces. And I think that's last. Oh, this is the last image I guess I have in this. I don't know how many of you drive to UNM via Central, but on the south side of about Central between 2nd and 3rd, there's a mural, and the mural is about voting rights. And as you can see here, there are several figures who were important in asserting voting rights for all New Mexicans. Here we have Miguel Trujillo, who advocated for a Native American right to vote. And here we have Nina Otero-Warren in her role as advocate for suffrage. So next time you're noodling down Central, take a look at this mural that's there. And if you're looking for a little more information for any of the things I quickly mentioned during this presentation, feel free to check out this bar is not letting me get there. To check out, this is a blog entry I recently did for the New Mexico Humanities Council. There are links to some of the more recent publications on women's advocacy for suffrage, especially women of color. A link to the information about the quarter, a link to the book on Felipe M. Chacón, and some other information here, such as the historical women's marker initiative marker for her, which is actually I think it's in Los Lunas, it's very near La Constancia, where she was born. You can get a little bit more information about her and other important women in New Mexico's history as they were sort of commemorated through the Historical Women Markers Initiative. And I can drop this link in the chat. And I think with that, I will stop. Let me grab that link.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nogar. That was amazing. Thank you. Your insights into the life and times and legacy such a wonderful woman who we don't know that much about. Certainly not to the level of detail that you've given us today and in all of your works, and we really appreciate it. We have a couple of comments, and I know the first one that came from Veronica Plaza. She wondered if you could post the Spanish versions of some of the things you were talking about. Does this have the Spanish, your blog post have some of those links, Anna?
Well, I just dropped the poem in the chat there, the word copy of the poem dedicated to Nina Otero-Warren. That's the Spanish version. I can drop the English version, but the English translation, but I think we modified it when we did it in the book. So both poems, the Spanish original and the English translation, are available in the Felipe M Chacón book. Let me grab that link and I'll drop it in the chat as well.
And you also have several people who thank you for the informative and fascinating presentation, Dr. Roy Ball and Lori Sloan. Did anybody have any specific questions?
Thank you, Anna, so much. This is Veronica Plaza. I was fascinated about the point that you made, that she wrote the piece that she did on adult education for Spanish, and I was wondering if it's any connection then from her legacy, from that piece to the Hispanic Education Act.
I would imagine so, although I haven't done the direct research to connect the two pieces. All of these political decisions and policy decisions that are later made are the project of a lot of soft political actions that occur that predate them, right? So some of the ways in which we have, for example, the New Mexico Constitution originally had protections protecting bilingualism in the state. That's the result of many, many years, 6 decades of advocacy to retain the language in the state. So whether there's a direct connection to her prior work, I can't say. But what I can say is that it is undoubtedly based on work like hers and that of other people who moved in that direction.
It's fascinating. I think, part of that advocacy, I know that's from the Constitution, with the current Hispanic Education Act, in terms of the advocacy to have bilingual education at not only K to 12, but in higher education, it's also is kind of an important piece to highlight. And I think it's a part of a big responsibility as that we have to carry that legacy within the university.
Certainly, and it's always a really interesting process to see with our students, to see them develop that capacity. And I think also to know how to read text, to read language outside of just an ability to communicate, right? To read it as a way of being with people. And I think that's one of the advantages, for example, of seeing something like this, the poetry that we read, the stories that we read, the cultural studies approaches that we take, and how those pieces work together. But thank you for your question.
I was fascinated by the three turn of the previous century, 19th, 18th, 20th century women that had autobiographies, and some of their recipes even making it all the way into the PNM cookbook that people still reference. I originally was introduced to the works of Nina Otero-Warren in a Chicana autobiography class that I took at UNM many years ago, and really enjoyed it. And the range and depth of the Chicana literature movement at that time, if it was called that at that time, was very interesting. Do you have any other recommendations for us with your background to understand a little bit more about history? Certainly, we'd like to follow you as well. It's very, very interesting, the work that you do.
Well, right now I'm working, so I mentioned Cleophas Jaramillo and her two memoirs, Romance of a Little Village Girl and Sombras del Pasado. And then Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca Gilbert, who grew up on the Llano Estacado and was a teacher and later a county extension agent. And her memoir, which is We Fed Them Cactus, which are probably the two that you encountered in Chicana memoir. And I think they're really important texts for understanding not only the feeling of the need to preserve and capture certain aspects of Nuevo Mexicano life of the time, but also to represent the voice of women. You know, something like a cookbook has until, fairly recently not been considered a sort of scholarly activity, right? It pertains to the house. So how much can it say about anything important? But we know that there's a lot of culturally coded information in cookbooks, right? We know that these types of literary or historical documents provide the great opportunity to read between the lines and just to read the lines themselves, right? How the meals are described. Reading some of these texts through a historical lens, it's interesting to see how they almost respond to a conversation that's not in the text itself, right? The idea that food in New Mexico is very simple in comparison to cuisines from other parts of the world. Well, both Cleophas Jaramillo, who also wrote a cookbook, and Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca Gilbert contest that in the way that they describe the richness and the complexity of the preparation of foods that originate from place, and also the idea of, again, formality, register, and presentation, which is sort of inherent to the way that they present these materials. This is also one of the purposes of Nina Otero-Warren, right? She wants to show that there's a long legacy, right? A historical legacy. She also wants to show, cultural production and the things that were valued at that time, right? In New Mexico at the turn of the 20th century, at the SAR, the School for Advanced Research, which focused primarily on anthropological approaches to Native populations, was established. And so this is in conversation. All of this is happening in the same place, right? The things that these women are writing are in conversation with those types of studies of their time. They also, in the case of Cleophas Jaramillo, who lost her only living child when she was a teenager, wanted to create a sort of living document that would be a legacy that she could offer down. And none of these documents is without problems in terms of how they're written, right? They're very much of their time. They're very much turn of the 20th century writing. But in that case, it's very similar to other writers like the Tejana Jovita Gonzales or Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton in California. They have some of the same difficulties with their writing. But I think we can still talk about what they contribute and what they preserve, right? And their push, and the thing that fascinates to me is Cleophas Jaramillo, for example, will say, I feel far more comfortable in Spanish, but I'm writing this book in English because I'm a little bit afraid that if I don't write in English, it won't be available. What I say won't be available to future generations. Right, so that speaks to that language anxiety that I think was very deeply woven with the project that they were engaged in. So those three are sort of the major figures because they were able to publish books. But one of the things that I found fascinating in sort of looking through newspapers, looking for bits by Nina Otero-Warren, and this is part of the complexity with Nina Otero-Warren, is aside from Whaley's biography, we don't have a collection of family papers or her diaries or letters or anything like that I'm aware of. And she's not my primary subject of study, right? But you're not working with that set of primary data that you might if you were working on a memoir of a person. And Whaley did work with some of those materials and interviewed members of her family, Otero-Warren's family. But one of the things so then another way of approaching this sort of research is then to look outside, to look at newspapers, to look at official documentation, to troll, for example, the WPA archives and see what little leavings you might find there of these sorts of publications. And in doing so with Nina Otero-Warren, I found the voices of women like Isabel Cordova, who's advocating for Spanish language retention at the same time that, say, Aurora Lucero White-Lee is writing to preserve Spanish in the public schools in New Mexico in 1911. And so these voices are emerging in places like newspapers, as well as in family collections and small publication items. And that's one thing that's super interesting to me, right? I'm now working on a project on Aurora Lucero White-Lee. And again, I don't have any family papers to work with or anything like that. So it's all coming from the newspapers. In her case, that's very helpful because her father was a newspaper editor. And so there are many items. And the thing that struck me as I continue to look for materials, and again, as I mentioned, Aurora Lucero Whiteley is a cousin of Nina Otero-Warren, is just how involved these women in Nuevo-Mexicanas were in the politics of the place. Whether they, obviously very few were elected to office, but many of them held positions. As I mentioned, Soledad Chavez Chacón and Nina Otero-Warren both held sort of significant leadership positions. Soledad Chavez Chacón, I think, was governor of the state for 2 weeks when the governor was having surgery or something like that. I'd have to double check that. So this is another interesting way in which we see very obvious examples of this. But what the newspapers document is this more or less constant motion in the background, right? This constant engagement with institutions, the advocacy for rights for children, the establishment of women and children's welfare boards, a push to make sure that there's a juvenile court so that children are not tried in adult court, right? So these are all things that Otero-Warren was very active in and saw to completion. So anyway, once you start mixing it around in the newspapers and you see what gets documented and what is reported on, you get a much clearer picture for things that we don't often hear about in history books, which is this action that occurs outside of election, right? And which we all know to be so powerful even in the present day. You don't have to just be holding an elected office to be having an impact on the community. And I think that's one thing that we can see in the case, certainly in the case of Otero-Warren, and in the case of many of the other women of her generation who are talking, who are advocating, who are organizing, who are moving around. There's this fantastic picture in one of the newspapers, which I've somehow lost the bookmark for. It shows her, driving around in, sort of an early Model T of rural New Mexico, stumping, right, going from place to place to advance her candidacy. And that's a lot of time, that's a lot of effort, that's a lot of interpersonal face-to-face contact, bilingual contact that she's making with her future constituency.
Well, thank you for that. I'm really curious how, with the limited amount of information that's actually, in the history books and known, besides, your in-depth looking at different alternative sources, do you have any feel for how her story was elevated to the level of the U.S. Mint to be selected as one of the 5 women from across the country who are to be on a U.S. quarter?
I don't. I wish I could say that I did. I was consulted for one of the designs that was proposed for the coin, not one that was suggested. So I knew that it was in the works. I knew that she was one of the people that was going to be advanced for the quarter. But I don't know why she was chosen. I suspect, I think she's the only woman of this first run who's specifically targeted for suffrage, but also, for these other important political roles that she played during her life. It's pretty incredible to have just earned not only the right to vote, but even to run for office and to whip around, I think it's less than a year after those laws are passed, and run for Congress. That's
amazing.
Amazing. And to give it a good run and lose by a very narrow margin. I mean, when you consider all of the things that were stacked against her, or that at the very least, she didn't necessarily perhaps have the wind at her back for at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
I find that super impressive. And then she continues, of course, to advocate and to participate in these in various types of organizations around the state, of course, the WPA. And this is another thing that has sort of struck me with conversations recently about, I don't know, maybe things such as infrastructure, right? I look back to the WPA, and of course, as somebody who looks at historical documents, it's such a wealth of information. Children are still attending school in our WPA buildings here in New Mexico, right? Those places still exist. The repositories of information that were created through the WPA are still important. They're still fascinating, right? And so I think, I guess I look back on them with a great deal of gratitude and excitement for future research.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all of these insights. And you certainly gave us a really good picture of the lifetimes and legacy of Nina Otero-Warren and your research as well. And I really appreciate your time today. And we're just about at the hour, and my cat is showing up. She's enjoyed the talk as well. Thank you so much, Anna. Anna is one of my cousins, and so it's always good to see you.
Nice to see you too, Melissa. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.